folks. Well, look at that, Pacific Ocean. Powerful waves crashing onto the beach. Well, yeah, this is what you get. A beautiful scenery. It's a lot colder. No longer do we find ourselves with the warm, sunny beaches. No, this is Northern California. Still California, still the same state, but we are a world away. Northern California is very much different, and it never really gets hot here. No, it's always very mild, very overcast, and it's actually pretty cold today. I'm gonna try to get to a point where it's a little less windy. It's always gonna be windy at the Pacific coastline. Oh, how excited I am to begin our journeys in this half of the state. When it comes to the history of this majestic California coastline, there have been many, many influences which have contributed to the colonization. I mean, we could theoretically start out with just the indigenous groups here. Around this area of California, lots of Pamoan-speaking peoples, and of course the Miwoks. And then, of course, we touched on the Spanish influence and later Mexican influence. And what country are we in right now? America. The United States had tremendous influence. But little is known, or rather, little is commonly known about the Russian influence of California. Yes, did you know that the Russians, who are native to the eastern woodlands of Europe, traveled all the way through Siberia to their side of the Pacific coast onto Alaska, and then went down the coast of the Pacific Northwest to reach Northern California? It was for sure such a different journey to get to this spot than the British or the Spaniards or the Americans. This history is drastically different from any other regional colonial influence, and that's what we're here to examine today, here at the legendary Fort Ross. So I think it's high time we move ahead, start our day, get past these stockades which guard Fort Ross. Join me on this day of cultural discovery at Fort Ross, the hidden Russian-American colony right on the California coast. We're now inside Fort Ross. Now this fort wasn't named after anybody named Ross. It was just the old way, as it's presumed, to say the Russians, the Rus. Originally, the Russians had come from the Eurasian landmass, and they had traveled through the northern Pacific, hopping along the Aleutian Islands, eventually making their way to Alaska, and they had already set up many different settlements and colonies, such as what we call today Sitka, but they called it New Archangel, or Kodiak. And they made their way down the Pacific Northwest until they got to this point. A very foggy, windy cliffside in Northern California, what's today known as California. And this is the southernmost point that the Russian-American company ever really got to settle. But hey, they did a really good job, and for a little less than 30 years, this was under Russian dominion. Now, why did the Russians want to create a colony here? Well, the answer to that is because everybody else was making colonies. You had the British, Spanish, French, all throughout North America. And the Russians wanted their slice of the pie too. So they had things in Alaska, they had things in the Pacific Northwest, and they were a growing power in the early 1800s. The great thing about this area is that it is a California state park. So of course preservation efforts have been here for a long time, and you can find things that weren't there at the original colony, like these signs in both English and Russian. The Kuskov House, the leader Ivan Kuskov led the Russian-American company here in 1812, started the colony, and I guess this is what his abode was. Domnya Pravitelya. Oh my goodness, this is terrific. Tools and everything. Oh, nice, comfy, rustic bedroom. Guess Ivan Kuskov was living it well here at the colony. Now the Russians, they were as far from home as any colony could be, halfway around the world. And so they needed defense. And so if they had to protect their colony, they would, and they would defend it by any means necessary. Cannons right there. So if there was an enemy that approached from the Pacific or on land, this was a nice refuge from which cannons could be fired. Even the Spanish, who were the main force on this western part of the Americas, they knew that they could not kick the Russians out on their little stretch of turf. Similar to many colonies of North America, Fort Ross brought with it religion of the colonizer. In this case, it was the Russian Orthodox Church. So as you see on the sign, chapel, Chasovnya. Yeah, unfortunately, these colonies didn't really have a lot of money, so they're not going to be like the fancy decorated churches in a big city, but mostly just made of wood. And you can't have a frontier colony without a place to store all the goods that are being traded. And this was a great place to store it. As you can see, vino, wine, rum, gin, patoka. I don't know what that is. Now, outside of the fort is where most of the residents of this colony lived. This was essentially a military outpost to protect the most important, valued things and people. But if you were just an ordinary person coming from anywhere from the ends of the earth, most likely you just lived with humble accommodations. At the inception of Fort Ross as a colony, it was intended to serve as an agricultural base. I guess down here it's just warm enough to be able to grow lots of crops to support Russia's northern colonies, where it may be too cold. But what really sustained this colony was the sea mammal fur trade that was trans-Pacific. From here, there's lots of wildlife such as sea otters, seals. If you can get those furs, that's an expensive commodity that can be traded all around the world, to Asia, even to Europe, from this point. But the Russians could not do that on their own. They relied on the Aleutian peoples, whom the Russians met way up in Alaska. So there was a prominent group of Aleutian people working here, far away from home, just as the Russians were. Of course, the local Kashaya people were involved in a lot of trading. Many Kashaya natives lived here as well. As you can see, there was a lot of interaction not only with local tribes or other indigenous groups of the Americas, but also foreign colonial powers such as the Spanish, who held control of Alta California at the time. Wow, take a look at the size of these trees. And these aren't even the largest trees we're going to be encountering here on our Best of the Most West trip, but I thought it was a fun little segue to show you all that we're now in the part of California which has a lot of beautiful trees, huge trees. Fort Ross as a colony did okay. I mean, it wasn't the most profitable colony in the world at that time, by no means. At some points there were periods of struggle, but it did manage to stay intact, in operation, and with their Aleutian friends, they were able to take advantage of the seas that lay beyond them. But in fact, there was so much considerable Russian influence in this area that even a nearby river to us is named from their influence, the Russian River, which flows just a bit south of Fort Ross's current location. They called it the Slavic River, or even Slavyanka, but the theme of the name of this river kind of stuck. In the latter years, things started to tank. By 1841, the abundance of sea mammals in this Pacific Ocean right by the coast had been depleted by not just Russian but other colonial forces in the area. British, American, Spanish. Yeah, humans will do what they do best: alter the natural habitat and ecosystem. So by the year 1841, to the standards of the Russian-American company, there was no more real need for Fort Ross. There was no more profit being turned in. And so this colony, the area, was sold to John Sutter, a Mexican citizen of Swiss origin who bought the land and turned it into his own. It wasn't until the early 1900s when this property was given back to public hands. The state of California soon after turned Fort Ross into a state park. There were some troubles along the way. The 1906 earthquake really did some damage to the area, but it was restored, and eventually now it stands as a state historic park. Okay, I should probably step away, a little bit away from the ocean. Those waves are actually very, very dangerous if you're not careful and you just think it's a regular beach. No, those could really rip you into the ocean blue and you'd never be seen again. So here at a safe distance, it's a great place to give the last word of today's adventure. So the Russians have been gone from Fort Ross for over 150 years. So why is this important? Why are we even covering this? Surely, such long ago influence doesn't have any effect on us today in our pursuit of knowledge. Well, that's wrong. The Russian explorers and people who came along with, who weren't necessarily explorers, came to pioneer the study of nature and culture here in the Pacific Northwest. They were the first people to document the culture of the local Californian tribes, and with regards to nature and ecology here north of I don't know, the San Francisco area. The Russians were the first to discover and study it for the European academics. In addition to contributing massive amounts of untapped at that time information about the world of the Northern Pacific, archaeological findings from much later than the inception of this place as a state park indicate that there may just be much more to learn about in the future with regard to Fort Ross as a colony and the surrounding California coast. For as much as we think of those great powers, those big name players in the great game of colonial territorial acquisition, the Spanish, the French, the British, the Russians were in on it too, albeit a smaller but still substantial role. Yes, they did play such a role in the Northwest. We spent so long in California already, and yet we are only a little more than halfway done with our coverage of the Golden State. It's a big state with a lot to talk about, so I won't hesitate any further. I will end the video now with anticipation for the rest of our California journeys. So I will not occupy any more of your time. We have more California coverage to get to. So looking at the powerful Pacific Ocean, but in a much colder environment. More travels to come. I will see you at the next location.